So at this time, I would like to turn the webinar over to Sandy and Nick.
Thank you, Elise, and welcome everybody to our webinar today. This is Sandra Serkes. I'm the President, CEO, and co-founder of Valora, and I am delighted to have Nick Inglis joining us. As Elise said, if you have questions, please send them to her, and we will dive right in. Welcome, Nick.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, Sandy. It's been really interesting watching Valora really transform itself over the last couple of years. It's been nice to watch the future of technology really form in front of our eyes. So without further ado, I want to talk a little bit about. Let's start with a simple question. Why does records and information as a function in your organization exist? It's a very simple question, and it's one that we should all be able to answer in one way, shape, or form. Why does records and information exist as a function within our organizations? And I'm going to come back to this question in a little bit, because this really is at the crux of what comes next for information governance and for information strategy as a whole within organizations. So to get to the answer of that question, let's go back to some basics. And we're going to go back to some simpler times when things were simply paper-based. You would have paper come into an organization, and it'd be mailed, or someone would draft something up. You would take out the paper from the envelope, the paper would go into a folder, and the folder would be simply filed away into a file cabinet if it was considered worthy of saving. That was what gave us our definition of a record. And this kept going on for years. Paper would come into the organization, and we would file it away in its proper place. And it would basically be the records manager who would determine what was required to be saved and what wasn't. And then we were saving more and more records and more information as time went forward. Companies grew larger, the influx of information continued, and we were getting to a point where we were reaching capacity in this simple paper-based model. We started to reach capacity, but we ended up getting bailed out. And we were bailed out through technology. And we've continued to avoid capacity through the use of different types of technology. And it simply started out with things like microfiche and microfilm. We could store multiple pieces of paper on a smaller form. And then it continued on, and we saw additional technology come to the fore. We had our early server rooms. We had the invention of the PC. We had our tape storage. We had our early server rooms, which looked wildly incompetent compared to the new server rooms, which looked beautiful. And then we moved things to the cloud. And we've continued to avoid capacity, whether that capacity is our capability to look at individual pieces of paper, or that capacity was the amount of storage space that we had in our locations. We've continued to avoid capacity through the use of newer technology. Moore's Law has been on our side. Now we move forward and we look at identifying records. Let's take a look at this from another perspective. So we talked about avoiding capacity through technology. Now let's talk about how we identify records. When we were in the paper-based world, we had individual records managers. Those individual records managers would look at each and every individual piece of paper coming into their organization. Every single piece of paper would get viewed and reviewed by an individual records manager. Well, eventually the amount of information coming into the organization became too much for the individual records manager to personally review. And that's when we began delegating. and we delegated the core process of records management, which is determining what is a record. We delegated that out to our employees. We moved that process outward in the organization. When we moved that process outward into the organization, we reduced its success factor. So we moved that records identification out to our employees, but in doing so, we reduced the successful identification of records. So our goal has been, instead of developing new records managers, we've been developing little records managers throughout our organization. So we've been teaching these precepts of records management. We've been trying to teach individual employees whose jobs have nothing to do with records and information management whatsoever how to do specific portions of records management. And that hasn't really worked all that well. We've seen success rates that have been in previous studies. We've seen success rates of anywhere from 60 to 90%. Nothing really over 90% success in identifying records. It's kind of problematic. And those numbers have continued to decline as employees have started to get more and more information. So like our records managers before them, the influx of information is becoming too much for the individual employees. We saw the advent of email. More and more email is coming into individual employees. And then we have mobility devices. And we have different types of information coming in through different social networks, through iPads and iPhones and Android devices and different types of technology devices. We have social content, we have blog content, we have different types of enterprise systems for different purposes. We have information being stored in multiple places. Then we have these cloud apps so that we now have information that's stored well beyond our own servers and our own control. And cloud app after cloud app for different purposes within the organization. We have commenting, we have forums, we have discussions and communication. And what this does is it makes our employees sad, because now they have different types of information and they don't know how to classify that as a record or not as a record. They don't know what should be a part of this records management thing anymore. So we've now reached capacity for our employees. We reached capacity with our records managers. We avoided that capacity by moving it out, to the records identification out to our employees. Now our employees are reaching capacity. Let's take another look at this from another perspective. The problem that we have today, we're going to look at it a few different ways. Let's talk about how we dispose of records at this point. Now, disposition is another core tenet of records management. It's how we are supposed to be doing things. And it was really simple in the days of paper. You have a piece of paper. It gets to the point where we need to dispose of it. We take out the piece of paper. It comes out of its folder. And we dispose of it. We shred it. We pass it on to a company that takes care of paper for disposition. That was really easy. And we knew that when we got rid of that piece of paper, it was gone. Pretty simple. The piece of paper no longer exists in the organization. It is gone. The record is disposed. Things get more complex, though, when we start talking about our enterprise system. So we have a connected system that our entire company is using. Okay, well, we take out that file, we delete it, and we know that it's disposed of. So we've destroyed a record. We have disposed of a record out of our records management system in this case. But then we start seeing these fun things called network shared drives pop up in our organization, adding another layer of complexity. Because our employees haven't been classifying records properly, we have records that are popping up there. We have records popping up on desktops, laptops, mobile devices. We have records all around our organization. And the same record that existed in paper could exist in the records management system, could exist in the network shared drive, and could exist in multiple iterations on multiple devices in multiple systems. And frankly, we don't know how to delete them. We don't know that when we've disposed of something out of a records management system that it no longer exists in our organization. And that's a huge problem. Because it cuts to this question of why records management and why information management exists in our organization. That very first question I asked. Are we still reducing organizational risk through our records management processes? That was our primary goal for years. Now we're going to talk about it from a value perspective as well, and I speak to that quite a bit, is let's not focus only on risk reduction, but also the value that information brings to an organization and how we can increase that. If we're looking at it from a records and information perspective, we're primarily looking at those roles existing to reduce risk in an organization. And are we reducing risk when we don't know that when we dispose of a record, it's not gone? Are we reducing risk if we are subjugating our records identification to our employees and we don't know if they're successfully declaring things as records? I think the short answer is no. We can't with any confidence any longer know that we're reducing organizational risk any longer. I mean, we may be reducing it in increments, but we're not reducing it to zero. That's for certain. So what if we take a trip back in time and we start to wipe the slate clean? What if we could set this up completely differently? What would we do differently if we could go back in time? Well, if we were looking to structure things differently, we need to talk about what it is we were trying to achieve from the very beginning. We were obviously trying to reduce risk. I mean, that is the core goal, at least from the records perspective, is to reduce risk. We're trying to ensure compliance. We have all these different rules that are coming down from different governing bodies, from different agencies, even internally, ensuring that we're maintaining standards. Compliance is a big portion of what we're trying to do. Security. Even more so today, security has become a much larger concern, especially when we have diverse systems that may or may not be fully under our control. We're trying to retain things properly. The whole point of keeping this paper, when we initially set up the system, the whole point of keeping it was because we wanted to have that information accessible. So how are we retaining information? How are we keeping it and how are we making it accessible? And then at the other side of that, how are we disposing of that information, disposing of those records? How are we disposing of it consistently? So when we get rid of something from the record system, we actually know that it's gone. And then I give the good old etc. here, because there are so many other goals and it varies from organization to organization. Every company has their own goals for what they were trying to achieve through their information. For a pharmaceutical company, it could be getting a drug to market. For a construction company, it could be getting a building built. Every company is different. So let's talk about the methods of moving forward. And I propose that there are really 6, maybe 7 ways of fixing things. There are 7 ways that we could possibly be doing information going forward. And I'm going to give you both the viable and non-viable methods for moving information forward. So the first is our good old file room method, where we have a records manager or an information manager, and they individually, or maybe even a team, they look at every single piece of information that's coming into the organization and they determine what it is that we need to keep. What do we need to retain? What do we need to get rid of? Well, let's be serious. That ship has sailed, and it sailed a long time ago. This is not a feasible method for most organizations that have more than, say, 3 employees. It's just not feasible. All right, so let's look at the delegate method, where we move some of the records management functions and some of the information management functions out to our employees, where every employee then looks at their information and they they themselves figure out what is it that we need to keep, what is it that we don't need to keep. And we focus our efforts as information managers at education. We need to educate our employees, otherwise they won't understand what needs to be kept and what doesn't need to be kept. Well, let's be serious about this. This, despite our death grip on it as being the way that we want things to work, it's not working. And it hasn't worked for some time, for most organizations. And there are some people that say, well, heck with it, let's just keep it all. It's the Wild West. We don't need to identify what needs to be retained. We just keep everything indefinitely. Well, for most organizations, this isn't feasible because it presents too much risk. If we keep everything, we're keeping the smoking guns along with the valuable information. So for most organizations, this is beyond their risk tolerance. There are some companies that this might be great for them. It's my assumption that most companies can't do this, especially companies that have any type of compliance requirements. Okay, so let's move from these methods that I think are probably less viable to some more viable methods. So I'm going to show three. The last one that I'm going to show you, it's actually two different methods. We'll talk about it. So the first method that I see as viable, I call it the records categorization method. And you can call these whatever you want to. I'm just making up some names so that we can understand them and have a common vocabulary for this webinar. So this is the records categorization methods. And we look at this as leveraging classification for records identification. What we do is we set up a series of folders, content types, things like that. And through the use of those, we're automatically identifying what's supposed to be a record and what's not supposed to be a record. This is a very rules-based way of looking at things. We set up some rules, we identify things, and we try to avoid there being any gray area for our classification of information. And this might be a viable method. We'll look at it. We have the information categorization method. I tend to like this more for companies that don't have really stringent compliance requirements. So in this one, what we look at is leveraging classification, a lot like the records categorization method, but instead of trying to do this in identifying records, so we're identifying what's a record and what's not a record, we just toss out the definition of a record entirely. I know there's records managers on this call that have just gasped in horror. Stick with me for a moment. So you leverage the classification scheme to figure out how long you want to keep things, rather than trying to figure out what's a record and what's not a record. And you identify automatically what needs to be retained and for how long you want to keep it. Okay, and let's talk about that. That's a maybe, a solid maybe, and we'll go through this in some more depth. Let's talk about the advanced computing methods. So when I initially presented these 6 methods, it was back in, it was like 2010 or 2011. And I was interviewed by TechTarget, one of their publications. And I basically presented this to them in that interview. And there were some folks that thought I was absolutely crazy and basically told me as such. And you can go back and read the comment section on this article. I'll probably share it on my Twitter feed later. And in this method, it's software, some type of software. And at this point, we're going to leave the terminology alone. Software looks at all of our information, and it's the software that identifies what is a record or what it is that needs to be retained. So instead of this being rules-based, it's the software that's doing it for us. And I'm going to give this also a solid maybe going forward. So I see 3 ways of this, staying in the existing paradigms, the existing models, and 3 ways of moving our systems forward, moving our information forward. So let's talk through these last 3. The records categorization method. In this method, what you do is you develop a classification scheme, a series of folders, a series of sites, I don't know what the terminology is for your specific set of technology. If you're using SharePoint, it's one set of terminology. If you're using Documentum or you're using Box or some cloud provider, there are so many different ways of the terminology being utilized. But you're developing a classification scheme in some way, shape, or form to support records identification. So rather than you or your employees figuring out what is a record, where the paperwork or where the information goes within the systems ends up determining whether it's a record or not. And you identify your records based on the upload location, whether it's the folder, content type. You could even take this down to the level of taxonomy and metadata. And you focus in this method on declaring records through categorization. That's what this is all about. So here's a piece of information that comes into the organization as an example. It gets uploaded to the marketing library, and a piece of metadata is added that says it's a contract. Well, what is it? We know it's a record. This is obviously a marketing contract. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell us that this is a marketing contract. And we have in our classification scheme or our records plan a contracts retention bucket. We know how long this is supposed to stay around for. So we declare it as a record. That's how this method works. You don't need a lot of advanced technology for this to work. It just requires a ton of work and a ton of upkeep. Here's the potential negatives, because I want to be a realist about all of these methods. Accuracy of user metadata is still a problem. Now we talked about 60 to 90% accuracy on employees declaring records. Well, if you think they're that good at declaring records, you're going to love how they enter their metadata. The accuracy continues to be a problem. The development of the rules to go along with your classification scheme is a project, a big project. And most organizations that I've seen don't want to invest the required money and time into this type of a project. I don't know why that is, because it makes a whole lot of sense to have this type of classification to support you. But developing rules is a project. And it's a project that sadly doesn't get a lot of funding or respect. Potential negative, the supporting technology. If your system doesn't really help you in your classification, you've got a problem. This isn't going to work for you. And there are still systems out there that can't do this or can't do this well. All right, let's move on to the next model. It's the information categorization method. Now, this is where I gave the records managers who were on the call a bit of a heart attack, and I said, forget about the definition of a record. Let's just talk about information, or data, or files. It doesn't matter what terminology you use. Forget the term record. It has baggage. Forget it in this model for a moment. Focus on the word retention, how long we want to keep things. And then provide consistency across all information. Now, the records managers, they're the people that understand how long things need to be retained for. But let's get rid of that definition of what's a record and what isn't a record and focus on how long we need to keep things based on our compliance requirements, based on the usefulness of the information. And then we do it consistently. Here's an example. Piece of information comes into the organization. We don't declare it as a record or not. It's uploaded to the marketing library. The metadata is added that it's a contract. Wait, I'm using the same example, obviously. Okay, in this one, what is it? It's a marketing contract. Do we care if it's a record? No, we don't care if it's a record. We just know that we have to keep marketing contracts for 7 years. And at the end of the 7 years, we dispose of it consistently. The whole concept of a record is gone from this, but we're maintaining consistency so that we're still meeting those obligations. Let's talk about some potential negatives of this. We identify this content based on the categorization. Potential negatives in this model. Again, realism sets in. Again, accuracy of user metadata. Again, developing rules is still a project. Whether we're declaring it as a record or not, we still need these rules, and that's a project that doesn't get funded a lot. Supporting technology tends to be an issue. and I probably should have had some more in there, but I didn't. But let's also say compliance and requirements. There are some organizations, for example, if you're a defense contractor or you're a federal agency or even a state agency, you probably can't use this method. You have a specific definition of what is a record, and you need to maintain that because of some compliance requirement. But for, a technology startup or an innovative small company, you could probably get away with this method. Now let's talk about these last two models, and I lump them together in this as advanced computing methods. We'll give them some other terminology in a little bit. So we have analytics-based records identification, and this is where we develop records identification rules that our technology goes after. We utilize analytics, and the analytics and the technology come together to identify what's a record and what isn't a record. And we develop categorized disposition rules. And this is all done with technology. And then we dispose through those same analytics. It's our technology that figures out what's a record, and it's our technology that eventually disposes of those records. All right, that matches really nicely with our records categorization method, but does it with technology. This next method matches up quite nicely with our information classification method, but does it through technology. So we develop information retention identification rules. How long we're going to keep things is developed through the technology. We identify it through analytics. We develop disposition rules, and the disposition happens through analytics. Let's talk about some of the potential negatives. Again, realism at its core through all of these methods. In the past, analytics accuracy was a problem compared to the delegated declaration accuracy of humans. So the question is, who's stronger, technology or humans? When I presented this the first time, humans had the edge. They still could do it better. At this point, a lot of these technology platforms, hands down, it's the technology that does a better job than the people. Our employees are losing to the technology. Technology does a better job of figuring out what's a record and what's not, or figuring out where things belong based on analytics. That's a huge change, but that was a potential negative. Another potential negative is the cost. Let's be serious. When I first presented this, the cost of most of these technologies meant that the Fortune 10 could use these technologies. They weren't ready for prime time for the mid-market. That's changed a lot since the first time I presented this. However, cost is still a consideration. Another potential negative. This is the start of every apocalyptic movie ever created. The Rise of the Machines, every Terminator movie. The technology is growing sentience. No, I joke. That's obviously me kidding. I can't hear your laughter because we're doing this in a webinar format, but I'm going to assume you're all just in stitches in front of your computers. Another potential negative, and this has been getting a lot better over the last couple of years, is integration with existing enterprise systems. Because the technology had been newer, the jumps between systems were sometimes rough. The connections between various systems and the new technology, it wasn't there yet, but that's come a long way in the last couple of years as well. But these are the potential negatives. So paving the way forward, every company, every person that's on this webinar has to choose a viable model. You have to pick one. You can't keep living the ostrich method of if I just cover my ears and ignore the problem, we can just keep doing what we're doing and we'll be fine. You're not. It's not going to keep being acceptable for you to continue the methods that you've used in the past. The file room method is dead. The delegation method isn't working, and the keep it all method is probably insane. They're all incredibly unlikely to be viable for your organization. However, they're very likely to be the methods that you're currently running on. That's a problem. You have to determine now. Actually, you had to determine like 2-3 years ago, but let's do it now if you haven't already. Which model is going to serve your organization's goals into the future? Because these decisions need to be made now so that you can prepare for what's coming next. Because if you're left behind, your competitors are not going to be left behind. Which model is going to remain a viable option for you and your organization into the future? You need to make these determinations now. I can't stress it enough. Now is the time for you to start looking at this and figuring this out. You get to choose your own adventure, and that's the fun thing about the time that we're living in with regards to information management and information governance and information strategy. You have options, and you get to see your organization through a major shift from the old methods that are no longer viable to these methods that will be viable into the future. So why does the records and information function exist within your organization? I think we've answered that question. Records and information managers exist to reduce their organizational risk. That is the whole purpose. That's why all of this started. That's why we get paid. That's why you get a paycheck. So what is it that we were trying to achieve? Reduce risk, ensure compliance, maintain security, retain properly, dispose consistently, and then your organization's specific goals. That's what you're trying to achieve. The old models don't do that anymore. The new models can. Let's talk for a moment about auto-classification, then I'm going to turn it over to Sandy, who's really one of the world's foremost experts on auto-classification. The future is already here. Auto-classification, it is here. And if you're not paying attention, you're missing. You're missing out. You're missing out on the benefits to your organization, and you're falling behind. Information architecture becomes incredibly important. How you structure your information becomes incredibly important for auto-classification to be incredibly successful. Now, auto-classification can in turn inform your information architecture. So information architecture becomes important. And this requires work. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. You're shifting from an old, unviable model to a model that's going to serve your organization into the future. You can't expect that you're just going to be able to buy some technology and make the problem go away. This does require work. There's really no sugarcoating it. You will need resources to get this done. It requires a comprehensive understanding of your organization's information. And who better to help transition the organization that you're in right now than you? You know your organization's information through the lens of information management, through the lens of records management, whatever it is that your role is. You're here talking about the future of your organization's information. You already have some idea of what you have, and it's your expertise that's going to lead your organization into the future. And it requires the knowledge of how to classify that information without leaving gray area. The gray area becomes your enemy. So you need to come up with an understanding of your information that puts things into nice, clean buckets in some way, shape, or form, whether it's you defining those buckets or it's your technology that helps you to define those buckets. With that, I'm going to pass it to Sandy because this is really her specific area of expertise. I can talk about the big picture, but when it comes to actually helping organizations do this, Valora does that. Sandy does this. So I'm going to pass the baton over to Sandy so she can talk more about how auto-classification actually works in organizations.
Okay, thank you, Nick. That was fantastic. I'm sure everybody really enjoyed that. I know I did. And thank you all for staying with us. Now we're going to do a bit more of a deep dive into auto-classification. Nick really set the table as to why this is coming to the fore. So let's get smart on it right now. So auto-classification is basically software, as Nick explained. Generally, it is custom configured to a particular environment. The state of the technology today is that Nick was very much on point. It's not something just out of the box, you just plug it in and go. There is a fair amount of customizing to each organization's circumstance, but once that is done, that's the work he was talking about, once that's done, then it is kind of plug and play. So you do get all the benefits of software doing the work. There's just a little bit of setup up front. And so the software has automatic, basically what we call algorithms, that's recognition patterns, for recognizing content and information. So Nick was sort of making the distinction between a record and information. AutoClassification really does not. It's really down at the unit content level. And so AutoClassification is looking at each piece of content, and it kind of views the world as either everything is a record or nothing is a record. And that's not a ding on the records management folks. It's a broader definition of the concept to evaluate every piece of information basically in the event that it should be retained or should be treated in a certain way. So these are the types of recognition algorithms that are in play. It typically is set up what we call middleware. So middleware, I sometimes will describe this notion of a bow tie. And Nick actually had a slide that was similar. I have one a little later on where I'll go into more detail. But the idea is, if you can sort of envision for yourself a bow tie, and you have in the center the knot is where all the intelligence about the content lives. And that's where knowing what all the content is and how it should be used and how it should be retained and how it should be classified, that's the brain of the operation. And off to the left, you might have the content as it's stored, and off to the right, the content as it's needed. So that's what we mean by middleware. I'll get into more detail as we go along. Just to give an example of the type of information that can be classified, most people don't realize, because when we were doing it on paper, the classification was literally what folder does it go in. If you think of that as the metadata of the paper, it was one data element, the folder location. As we started delegating that work out to employees in the organization, we got a little bit more metadata. You got the location, the file location. Maybe you got the file name if they were good and named it something useful and not 123.doc, because that's not real helpful. And a little bit of custodial or path information just by virtue of how things are stored in a computer system. But again, that's about it for metadata. Once you add AutoClassification software to the mix, you have almost an unlimited capacity for creating and deriving rich metadata for every piece of content. Here's an example. In a kind of legal, sort of large law firm, would be able to capture all of this kind of information from pretty much any piece of content, provided that the information was present. So this is a little bit different than the existing metadata that exists with a file. This would be a lot of work to ask people to do manually. And again, it's where automation has an advantage. I have about 8 things listed here. In reality, there are about 600 fields of potential metadata that can be created at the push of a button. And so that's really something to think about. We're now kind of crossing that line between records being a risk area and information being a knowledge asset area. Okay. Nick mentioned rules, and there are absolutely rules involved in using AutoClassification. And so I wanted to just briefly explain to people what that is. So again, they're algorithms that kind of determine the disposition of the content. So in other words, rules are a little bit like if-then statements. And so you can see an example. They're very dependent on metadata. And again, that's why maybe you don't want to have people enter metadata, because it's kind of a pain in the butt. If the software can produce its own metadata, now you're talking. So what you see here, the italics, is the metadata field, and this is the value. So document type is a pretty critical piece of metadata. Now, I'm not talking about file extension. I'm talking about the actual type. So if the software can determine that it's a contract and the date, let's say, that it was signed or enacted, then it can run this rule that says if you have this document type and the date is less than this date, then mark it as active. That is to retain it. Now you see a very simple example of how rules-based disposition works. What do you need to make it work? Of course, you need this data. That's where the auto-classification comes in. Here is a full rundown of the different types of disposition that you can take. We talk a lot about retention, security starting to get a lot of play, but there's quite a lot of other ways that you might want to move content around into different buckets. You might be migrating to another system or moving content up to the cloud. Those are excellent opportunities to provide auto-classification and rules assignment. Okay, so just to kind of get people on the same page, I mentioned it with software. This is a kind of typical view, and it is, of course, Valora's view. What I'm describing right now is that knot in the center of the bow tie. This is what it looks like inside. There's going to be a database layer, and this is for storing that metadata that gets created. This is the creation of the metadata and a number of other things, and this is the presentation of that. For the IT folks in the audience, this is for you. Everybody else just glaze over. It's okay. But basically what's happening is you have a auto-classification engine, in this case Powerhouse, essentially acting as a transfer agent, looking at content where it lives, running all kinds of algorithms and analytics, and then placing it back out where it goes with all its kind of commensurate metadata attached. Then you have, in this case, Black Hat, but it could be anything, a type of viewing mechanism for that content and for that metadata. This could be a DMS or an ECM if you have that as well. Okay, everybody else, wake back up. All right, here we go. So how does auto-classification actually work? It's kind of a three-step program. The first thing is that Powerhouse or any other system identifies a file, a piece of content, a record, that needs some analysis. And so it kind of analyzes that information and one way or another gets to a text basis. That's the trick. And don't worry, even if you have microfiche or images, a little bit of OCR goes a long way to making text. Once there's text, this tagging sequence commences in which we're doing all those pieces of metadata, that rich metadata creation, and basically making a metadata record about each piece of content. So again, what's the record, what's not? Let's not get caught in semantics. The point is that we're evaluating every piece of content and determining a full gene sequencing kind of lab report on each one. And then finally come the rules, that disposition layer that says, let me look at that text, let me look at all that attribute metadata and make a decision. Should this be retained? Where does it belong, etc.? And so that is how the technique works. Here's a little bit what it looks like. So here is a sample email you might find in a law firm or a legal department. And what we're going to do is auto-classify by matter number, right? Almost all law firms or legal departments are tracking by matter number. And so this is what software is going to do when it auto-classifies. It goes through and starts pulling out that metadata. You can, of course, see the ringer right there. It knows about attachments and that content and the implicit relationship between attachments and a parent email. So here's that tagging step, the orange, and here's the blue, which is the rules engine. It's saying this content needs to be tagged thusly and thusly, and then the disposition is put it here. It belongs in this location. Okay? Here's another example. Here's a patent application to show you a bit of the rich metadata going. Just goes nuts and starts pulling out metadata, whatever it is that could be useful, and it's storing that away in the database so that you can perform a disposition. For example, if you're in a litigation situation, this could also be an implied status about the security of this document or the content. Who should have access to this? Who not? Here's one that comes up all the time. You guys are probably familiar with the concept of ROT, for redundancy, obsolescence and trivial information, how do we find all that goop and get rid of it? Here's a really good example. Happy New Year 2014. Anybody got that sitting in their inbox anywhere? I know I do. Okay, so software goes through and says, aha, we've got some watch list terms. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Generally not considered useful in a business context. We've got a year, okay, 3 years ago, 2.5. There's also no further content, heavy graphics, and 4,000 identical copies throughout the organization. Chances are that this is junk, this is rot. So go ahead and change its status. So again, here's the tagging, here's the rules. And then finally, we'll show you a fancy one. You can start to play the security game for real down at a content level. Let's identify PII, or personally identifiable information, in content, okay? And there's a ton of it in here. So same thing, software's going to start going through and finding, oh, social security number, straight up PII. Some other goodies like might be PII. It says title will be held by. And so we have a name and an address. Once those two are brought together, what we call data triangulating, then yes, that's going to become PII. Here's some more, home phone number. There's things that are not PII, not everything on here. A mortgage rate alone is not PII. And so if we are classifying this document, we would classify it as it has active PII. It needs special protection, possibly redaction in its storage and in its presentation to other folks in the organization. Clearly, some people are going to need to see this document as it stands, and probably other people will see a redacted version of it. Again, that's something that the AutoClassification is aware of and can produce. All right, so I mentioned auto-redaction. It is exactly what you think it is. It is automated redaction of offending text or phrases. Lots of different ways to do it, purposes for it. And this is what it looks like. No way. Okay, I've described what auto-classification is. There are quite a lot of use cases for it. The biggest ones right now are migration. As I said, that's moving data from one system to another. That includes pulling it off of everybody's hard drive and onto a central server. And then also, obviously, litigation's a big driver, as is knowledge management. And it's kind of nice to see this one because this is less about risk and more about information as a knowledge asset. But those are the big ones that are kind of taking place right now. Security as well. So if you are looking for ways to sell your organization on auto-classification, this is the sheet for you. Okay, I mentioned the bow tie. Here is the bow tie picture in full. So here's that middleware, that auto-classification engine sitting in the center. On the left, you have the content where it lives. It might be coming in via email. It may be sitting on shared servers. People may just drag and drop. That's an option as well. And in our case, Powerhouse is basically kind of monitoring these and looking at data as it gets created or as it's given permission to go poll. That's poll with an O, where it's basically kind of checking in. I call it like the got milk. Got milk? Got milk? Same thing. It's looking in there and seeing, have you got anything that needs to be classified? So this is, if any of you have been following Gartner and their proclamation that ECM is dead and now it's all called content services, this is the picture of content services, where the service is in the center, the content where it lives, and you'll hear about people processing in place. That's what this is. And then there are the systems that need the information that may not necessarily host it themselves. And so what you have here are two locations where metadata lives and or the file itself. So if we are going to do a migration from that kind of kitchen sink L drive that every organization seems to have into proper classification, now you see that middleware and the bow tie. The last piece of the bow tie, and a lot of people don't realize this, when you set up rules for classification, they need to be kept current. Just because you set it up today, 6 years from now, you might be gone, and certainly things will be different. And so the way to handle that is to have your classification engine querying the other systems. Nick mentioned connectors. And that's exactly what's happening here. Have your classification engine connecting to other data sources for guidance data so that it is always current. For example, one of the things we might be classifying is the author or the kind of custodian of the information. You want to stay current with the HR database to know who's still employed with the organization at any given moment. And so there's a kind of back-end syncing that happens here as well. Elise, that was a whole lot of content, and I realized we didn't stop for questions. So I'm going to stop now and see what has queued up for questions for Nick or me.
Oh boy, let's see. Well, we'll try to get to a few of them. So these are, I believe, these are for Nick. They came in while he was speaking. I'll give you two because they sort of go together. How do you go about identifying what data to govern, and then how does one initiate the governance cycle?
Whew, that's a tough question. So how do you identify which information to govern? I mean, ideally, any information within an organization that has value should be governed. So whether I like to say it doesn't matter its form, it doesn't matter its format, it doesn't matter its location, it matters that it has usefulness to the organization. So where Sandy discussed the rot or the files that are not useful. So her example was that Merry Christmas message. Now obviously that's something that doesn't need to be governed on an ongoing basis, but really everything up to that point that has business value in any way, shape, or form needs to be governed in some way, shape, or form until it's either it reaches its retention point, its disposition point, in which case you dispose of it, or it ends being useful to the organization, in which case you would want to dispose of it because it has no ongoing business value. So I hope that answered the question. The other piece, do you want to repeat the second portion of that one for me, Elise?
Sure. How does one initiate the governance cycle?
So initiating it, I mean, this is where most organizations struggle, is they look at information governance as this huge, massive project, a scale of which seems completely unattainable. I always say look for the area where there's a business problem that you can solve and start with that. And this could be something small even, or fix one simple business process that provides value. Because initially with any type of project around information, it's challenging to get the funding right off the bat. So what you need is some sort of proof project, a project that doesn't cost a lot of money but has a potential to provide a lot of business value. So start with that project, show that you have the chops and the skill and that the things that you're talking about provide value to the organization as a justification for a larger scale project later on down the line. But definitely start with some sort of business problem.
I actually have some suggestions because we get asked this question all the time. Most people are pretty impressed with the technology and then they're like, okay, how do I sell this up? So 2 concrete suggestions. One would be to propose removing rot from your organization, because what people don't realize is that rot is expensive. It's expensive in a couple ways. One, it's taking up disk space, so you're paying for that one way or another. 2, it's getting in the way when you're doing searches or you're trying to retrieve information. That's a whole other webinar. But you're pulling up rot half the time. If you've got 30-40% rot, you're that much more inefficient across the board. Very easy to justify an ROI on removing rot, and if you need that, contact me because yes, I have it. The second kind of easy pickings, in addition to just removing rot, is to deal with the files that have been left behind from employees who've left your organization. Because nobody but nobody is organizing that content, and it's just sitting there. One, it's a risk. Two, nobody's able to kind of utilize it, again, in search or any kind of way. Three, you're paying for its storage, and maybe half of it doesn't even need to be there. So that's, again, easy pickings, and you're not likely to get a lot of complaints because the owner of that information has left the building. So it's a great way for kind of, what you're really trying to do is kind of take back or create that centralized management and control of information, and you won't find any resistance from people who are no longer there. So that's another reason we recommend starting there.
Those are great suggestions.
real world, battle scars.
True business problems to solve.
Elise, I think we probably have time for one or two more.
Yeah, how you use the term middleware. Can you explain that again? Does that mean you don't have to buy the software?
No. What middleware means is it's sort of like this picture. It is between, it depends whether you're moving content or you're just assessing content. And that is a raging holy war right now. There are organizations that are like, oh no, you will not move my data around. Or the records management and information governance group does not have the authority to move other departments' data around. In that case, you want to leave the content where it is, process in place, and just literally move the metadata around or pointers to data that feel like you're moving data, but you're not actually. Or you're going down the other path where you are literally migrating data to an ECM, to a DMS, to a cloud-based repository, and saying, get it off the desktop and get it where it belongs. In both cases, you can think of AutoClassification as a filter that is filtering the information about the files and creating that rich metadata database. That's the middleware piece. So hopefully that addressed that. One more, Elise?
Yes. My company just went through a major data migration to World Docs last year. Our IT folks are still dealing with viruses from email attachments transferred during the migration almost a year later. How does your technology identify viruses?
That is a great question. There are a lot of techniques for identifying viruses. You have two options. One, of course, you're identifying viruses. The other is you're identifying positive content and positive non-content. So, for example, one of the key things that we do, it's not quite at the virus level, but it's a good example, is identify logos. Because logos sometimes are very stupid, and they take up a lot of room in an email system or in a storage system. And if you're having, a dialogue between two companies back and forth over the course of 6 months, you don't need 40,000 copies of each one's logo. It's ridiculous. You store a single copy, and the rest are pointers. A pointer is kind of like it's like a shortcut on your desktop where you're not really hosting the file there, but you're able to launch it from there. A pointer works the same way. So you want to kind of use pointers for data wherever you can, wherever you have to have multiple instances. Virus detection and management is a whole other arena that's much more sophisticated. Part of what would happen here is that one of these systems would be whatever virus detection technology the company has in place. Usually it's not the job of the AutoClassifier to have virus protection, but to be aware of it. So it would be another system down here that the AutoClassifier is connecting to, and so it's, again, stays current because virus detection is constantly changing, stays current, and that it's tagging and analyzing information on an ongoing basis. The migration that was described in the question, Elise, sounded like a one-shot deal, and it does highlight one of the rules that I would like to share with everyone, which is don't migrate first and assess it second. Assess first and migrate second. That's the right sequence so that you're not migrating junk or worse into your new environment. All right, well, we're kind of coming up on the hour, or maybe we're there. Nick and I will hang out for a few minutes. We're happy to answer questions, but we would like to thank all of you for coming to the webinar. As I said, we'll stick around for a few minutes. I could do it all day, but Nick's got to go somewhere soon. So, Elise, we'll keep a few questions going if people are interested.
Okay, looks like we have a few people still staying on. Thank you so much. Here's another one. We are utilizing SharePoint, but it has been in play for years. It has grown unruly. My company does not have the appetite to spend money on more software. Can you treat this as a one-time project, and can you load back to SharePoint?
That is a great question, and the answer is yes to both. You can treat these things as a one-time, what we call backfile project, especially if that's the only appetite for spending right now. But bear in mind, you will eventually have a backfile again. You can clean house today, and then 6 years from now, you're going to have to do it again. Not impossible, and certainly SharePoint, actually you can see it down here, can be a destination location and all cleaned up as part of the effort, yes.
Okay. All right, I'm being told to ask more questions. So I think our system has over 4 million emails or maybe 4 terabytes on a server and an archive that could use this type of classifying. How long would that take?
That's a great question, and the answer is a bit complicated because it depends. I actually have a picture here. We'll go to the advanced class now. It depends what you have available as virtual machines for processing. What you're looking at here is just a simple 10,000 docs per hour. Obviously, 4 terabytes is going to want this is like a baseline, very early kind of simple setup. You'd want to start having 64 core, VMs. Not impossible and pretty much present in any modern day data center or cloud environment. So let's assume you have modern hardware is really what I'm saying. If you have modern hardware, 4 terabytes, maybe a month to clean it all up. That would include the configuration and testing and the iterations that go around. So something on the order of that.
Okay, great. And I have another one here, which we sort of talked about in January's webinar, but I think it's worth asking. Referencing opportunities for cost reduction, legal compliance, like risk reduction, but, the kind of things that CFOs approve, cost reduction initiatives, those, can you talk about that a little bit?
So the funding side has always been a challenge traditionally for information technology of our stripe. Even from the document management and ECM days, getting the funding for the right technology has always been a struggle. For me, it's always gone back to reaching back towards the meaningful business problem. If you can show that you're solving business problems that have real value and have dollar signs attached to them so that you can then do an ROI figure after you've completed your first simple project, you can get further funding later. So for technology like this, starting with something small, like a department's shared drive that's a nightmare, or look to call center data, or look to HR data. Look to a place where you can find meaningful business value that also has dollar figures attached to it, so that you can say, okay, for this investment amount, for a smaller investment amount, we were able to save this amount of dollars, which I would assume would be much greater than the initial investment amount. Then say, we have these additional problems in, every single other department in our organization. I'd like to start a project so that we can solve this across all of our departments and make meaningful progress across all. It's the start small and grow method. It's not always the prettiest, and it's not always the most. It's not always the quickest way from point A to point B. Whereas taking on the large project is probably the most effective way to exhibit change throughout the organization. It's often not what we have the opportunity to do. We often have to start small, show small progressive change, and then gain the trust of the decision makers to get further funds.
If I could jump in, I second everything that Nick said, and one of the techniques that we've found very successful is to start with a proof of concept and to bill it that way, or a pilot. Yep. And there is bang for the buck in this type of technology, because even to get a small project off the ground, there's a certain amount of configuration and setup of this middleware layer, and that does not get lost going forward. So the work that's done on that first department or that first proof of concept almost certainly is going to be utilized going forward. So you do get economy of scale. The more you bring on, the more cost effective it becomes. So there is, if you can get that first project through, the second project will not cost as much, and so on and so forth. So you start to really have this kind of building momentum at the same time as the costs are decreasing. So it's a nice effect that helps you continue selling over time. I also wanted to direct whoever's left. If you take a look at Valora's YouTube channel here, we do have a couple of videos there about the costs of these types of kind of inefficiencies and how they get solved with auto-classification and how to calculate an ROI and all that kind of stuff. So you might want to check out that channel for all kinds of fabulous video info on this topic. Okay, I sounds like we still want to keep going. Elise, do you have more questions? Or if anyone wants to jump in, I suppose?
Yeah, I have a few more here, and looks like we have quite a few people who want to keep going. That's wonderful. What's the most important thing to look for when comparing data classification tools?
Oh, boy.
Wow. I'll start on that. I'm sure you're going to have some additional thoughts.
Yeah.
My thought is always start with your specific business requirements. What is it that you're trying to achieve, and then go from there. A lot of projects that require technology, I see companies come at it and they have in mind a specific solution before they've evaluated what it is that they actually need. I mean, I saw that a lot 5-6 years ago with the rise of SharePoint. You'd hear at a conference someone talking about SharePoint, and then the executive would come back and say, hey, we need SharePoint, without really thinking about what it actually was that was going to do for their organization. With these new technologies, it seems like there's at least some thought going in, much more so than there was behind the buzzword-worthy technology. We'll probably see Black Hat come up as a future buzzword technology, but for now it goes back to what are the business requirements? What is it that we're trying to achieve?
I would add to that to think about where do you want the management and control of this information? Do you want a model that is basically centralized, either with IT or records or information governance or legal, that says we are the keepers of either the information itself or the rules by which we will govern information? If you have a kind of centralized model like that, then you want a system like Powerhouse, where there's a lot of flexibility, there's a lot of ability to gather information, 600 fields of metadata. You can use that in really rich ways. If your model is, no, everybody's kind of fends for themselves and the group in Kansas has nothing to do with the group in New York and there is no centralization of data, then you might want to look at solutions that are a little more downscale. I wouldn't advise that, because sooner or later there's going to come a lawsuit or an investigation where Kansas and New York are going to be brought to the table, and then you have a holy nightmare. But I do understand that there are organizations that operate that way. You might want to look real hard whether auto-classification will work for you, because in that scenario you're really going to be setting up two instead of one. So something to think about there. Elise?
Okay. Got a few more and still got a good group hanging on. Can the current data classification tools be integrated with the current environment in terms of operations and security?
I would say yes. That is the beauty of today's APIs and REST APIs and other kind of interoperability. That information about security and at least what's the acronym I'm thinking of that we talked about the other day with the DLP?
DLT.
Inheritance. All of that can be passed through very easily from system to system. So I would say yes, that is a reality today.
Yeah, it started with CMIS and it's only grown from there. Security can easily pass through systems.
Okay. Can files automatically classify as soon as they are created, moved, downloaded, or modified?
Yes, there's about a 2-second delay while Powerhouse does its thing, but yes, there's usually some event, some trigger that alerts the system that something new has been created. The typical things are a save, send, or some sort of movement of the file into a location, maybe a syncing, or an upload. Anything that kind of kicks off the hello, I'm alive kind of notion will launch an auto-classification moment, and 2 seconds later it will be done.
Great. Okay, I got 4 more questions.
Let's do it.
All right. This is awesome. Is it possible to require users to classify email and documents based on policy? To be clear, does this feature work on emails, attachments, and all documents?
I assume if we're talking about auto-classification, the answer is yes. Certainly works on email and attachments. And instead, before I say all documents, I'll say most. The documents that do not work well for auto-classification are documents that consist almost entirely of handwriting. Handwriting recognition is in its infancy, and it's just not strong enough. Remember in the beginning we said we need to get the text one way or another? So there are 2 types of information that don't have a lot of text: handwriting and images. Now images will have some metadata, especially more modern, but if you literally just have a photograph and nothing else, there's kind of not a whole lot to classify. So those 2 present challenges for auto-classification. But any kind of file that essentially has content in it, text in it, or can be made so, is going to do well.
Great. I have a new question that just came in. I'm going to go to it because it's a really good one. So the other ones have to wait. What challenges have you faced with encrypted data, especially when the keys are not held by the company?
Well,
that's why I pushed it to the front.
Yeah, at some point, yeah, there are roadblocks. I mean, if it can't be decrypted, then then you're kind of what we call SOL.
I feel like there's a use case here that someone's not sharing.
There is. But and the same thing goes that if data is being stored on a cloud somewhere, there has to be access provided. It's the same type of it's not magic. And so if everything's been encrypted and there's no key, you might want to contact a hacker or a legal hacker to decrypt. That's usually not in the domain of the auto-classification engine. It assumes that there's a key or an API, some way to get to it.
So, someone would have to have access to the data for it to any type of system to be able to utilize it. Otherwise, any system is going to look at it and just see gibberish. Yeah. So there'd have to be some sort of decryption possibility there. Even if it means that you're running the auto-classification software somewhere else.
Yeah, you can have that. You can have kind of different types of firewalls or access to data. You can store your content and your metadata separately. I mean, these are ways to kind of address security, but there's not a magic bullet for decrypting, unfortunately.
Okay. the individual who asked the question said yes, thinking about classifying data at rest at box.
Yep, that's quite doable.
Okay.
There we go.
He who shall remain nameless. and very happy with the responses. Awesome. Okay, so let's go back. I'm sorry, everyone who got pushed aside. That was too good of a question to leave it for last.
Encrypted one.
Is it possible to capture additional metadata information beyond 2 levels of classification?
Yes, in theory, there's kind of an infinite. The way that data is captured is kind of hierarchical, and you can go to as many levels as hierarchy as basically you can stomach. We usually don't suggest more than 3 or maybe 4, just because it becomes overwhelming to the human beings. Software's got no problem with it. But remember that there is a rules basis behind this, so you want to keep it simple enough that you, the human, can follow it. In some scenarios, the software is actually providing the taxonomy. If you want to go down that path, there's your apocalyptic story. Yeah. It can go forever in terms of hierarchy. It's really just a question of taste in that one.
Yeah, every time you add another layer, you're adding another click for a human. So it's not the auto-classification tool that's going to struggle with that. It's the person that's using, open text, who's clicking through folder after folder and waiting for the system to load each time. That's where you're really going to have the struggle. It's the human browsing, not the technology.
Okay, awesome. All right, 2 more questions. Classification sounds great. However, our clients have extremely sensitive information that would not be allowed outside our firewall. How do you handle these cases?
Oh, sure. At least in the case of Powerhouse, we would install it directly behind the firewall, would be configured and run. Everything would be local, no outside access. So it would become an on-premise system right alongside the data. So there'd be no issue with beyond the firewall in that scenario.
Flexibility to boot.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And last one I have here, at least for the moment. Do you work with the vendors on data migration or with the clients or both?
You work with everybody because everybody has some sort of finger in the pie. Again, to Nick's early point that there's some work and some complexity here, this is a good example of that. Yes, working with the vendor, like if there's a DMS vendor or cloud-based vendor, working with them, certainly working with clients. But at some point, everyone has their area of expertise, right? Somebody is the expert on what the data is. Somebody is the expert on the target destination where it's going. And somebody, usually me, is the expert on how to make them go there. But everybody kind of has their expertise, and yeah, usually is part of the mix in one way or another.
I'm sure you spent a lot more time talking to vendors when you first started with the software. At this point, as you've worked with specific vendors more frequently, you've sort of gotten a feel for each of the primary systems for most companies.
That is true. Yeah, that is true. And that's why, at least for Valora, this is why we've started to have partnerships with various vendors. To say, we're like for example, just to pick one, iManage. So we're an iManage certified technology partner. What that means is we're used to their systems and they're used to ours. So you do have that kind of, we've been playing together for a while. Aspect. And to the other question earlier, what should we look for? That's a good thing to look for, actually. What technologies is their history with? Was that it, Elise?
That is it. Does anyone have any questions? Those of you who are still out there?
Well, that was a fun Q&A session.
Yeah.
That was
There's
awesome.
some really great questions in there.
All right. Well, I guess we'll call it then. Thank you, everyone, for your time today and your outstanding questions. Nick and I had a great time. and we'll talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.